the real world does not hold those assumptions. In fact, in reality...
Does not
hold the assumptions. I talk with my hands, you know.
Hello.
Hey, welcome to Left Unread.
A podcast where two dudes engage in a radical self-education.
That's right. We're just two post-structuralists, post-idealists, post-modernists, post-Marxists, post-millennials trying to make it through this goddamn place.
Say that.
Yeah. And this week we read
Wage, Labor, and Capital. Finally getting to Karl Marx.
Yes, at long last. At long last, we arrive at Karl Marx, truly a towering figure of history. Philosopher, historian, economist, poet, beer enthusiast, bohemian womanizer, and much, much more. It's hard to discern the separation between Marx the man and Marx the myth. At the very least, he stands as a supremely influential figure on not only his own time, but no doubt centuries to come. Born 1818 in the Kingdom of Prussia, Marx studied philosophy as a young man, being deeply influenced by Hegel. He was a foundational member of the International Workingmen's Association, and until his death in 1883, wrote numerous influential pieces of literature, including the Communist Manifesto, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and the 3-volume beast, Das Kapital. I was browsing Internet Archive earlier. There's 1,000,001 biographies of Marx, and I've pulled some very choice quotes here.
Let's hear them.
Some really good ones. This is from Marx the Racist, by Nathaniel Whale. This isn't a negative quote, I just enjoyed it. He says, "Theories and visions of Karl Marx exert more influence on society than those of any other figure, living or dead, with the exception of Jesus Christ and the Apostle Paul. Marxism and Christianity have become two major surviving serious contenders for their allegiance of that portion of mankind which experiences the need for an integrated philosophy of life, offering an unequivocal life purpose." Right?
Yeah, that's a surprisingly positive review from
Marx the Racist.
Yeah.
Not a discussion for this episode, but there is some...
I did actually I was doing a little bit of reading on that this morning too, because it's something that I've seen popping up on TikTok more frequently lately.
Yeah.
The, embedded racism in the philosophy of Marx and Engels.
Yeah, there's a quote where he uses the N-word against LaSalle. And there's a great tweet where someone's like, fun fact, that was actually the least racist man in Germany in 1865.
That's actually probably true. Not an apologia by any stretch, but...
Okay, here's another one. "He exploited everyone around him, his wife, his children, his mistress, and his friends, with a ruthlessness that was all more terrible because it was deliberate and calculating. His tastes were those of a feudal aristocrat. He was one of those who are determined to command whatever the cost and pain and suffering of others. The only renowned author who's ever called his own writing shit, swinish books. He consciously gives his readers filth. No wonder then that his disciples, the communists in Romania and Mozambique, forced prisoners to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine."
This guy's got something against Karl Marx. I mean, first of all, for only renowned author to call his own work shit, Kurt Vonnegut literally scores and grades all of his work and gives himself D's and F's.
Yeah.
So... interesting.
Just some context. I saw this book at Goodwill, but that's from Marx and Satan by Richard Wormbrand, who's a Romanian priest or some kind of Catholic figure that was imprisoned for being Catholic, I'm assuming. And then the last one, this is my favorite. "On hearing a new French party claim to be Marxist, he replied, 'I, at least, am not a Marxist. Not since Jesus Christ has an obscure pauper inspired such global devotion, an angry agitator who spent much of his adult life in scholarly silence of the British Reading Museum's reading room, a gregarious and convivial host who fell out with almost all of his friends, a devoted family man who impregnated his housemaid, and a deeply earnest philosopher who loved drinks, cigars, and jokes.'"
I've heard a lot of talk about his supposed affair with his housemaid. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I didn't know about otherwise. Other than people criticizing Marx, I haven't heard of it. I've seen one person suggest that it's a completely unfounded claim or that there's no evidence. There's no evidence to give it any real credence, so it's just hearsay and it's worthless endeavor.
Like I said, I was going through like 6 or 7 different books, and that was just at a cursory search. Mm-hmm. Like, so much has been written, and a lot of it is, in English at least, in the fucking lens of the Western world. Yeah, so it's pretty clear. I do think that there exists a solid basis for a feminist critique of how Marx treated his wife and also his maid, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But, like the classic report where it says, I went to Marx's house and he lives in filth. He rarely bathes. That was like a spy report. That was like an intelligence report against him. Yeah. So it's hard to not think of some of these quotes as maybe a propagandistic game.
Yeah, some real COINTELPRO shit.
Yeah, and not even going that far. I just think that like people who are looking for something will find something of that nature. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He was an exile. Like he was not a popular figure in the eyes of the government by any means. So it's not it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that there was some, anti-Marx propaganda out there.
For sure. And even like you said, on a cursory glance online, you'll find that he died stateless, that he was certainly not in anyone's great favor.
Even on his Wikipedia page, it lists his nationality as without state, which is weird. It's not that weird, but you know.
Another thing, yes, I agree that Marx is not above criticism. None of the figures that we've read are above criticism, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves all the time that to lionize a person to the point that they no longer become, the object of criticism is anti-Marxist at its core. And I fall into that a lot with Lenin. I love Lenin so much, but again, not a perfect figure. But that also doesn't negate the work that they did and the revolution that came from their work.
Yeah. The impact of the writing is really separated from the man regardless. Like, that's kind of how I feel, to read about Lenin in whatever lens, that he was like a ruthless figure that wielded power and used terror to his advantage, those are jolting to read, but it doesn't affect his theory in my mind. I mean,
I don't necessarily want to open up a conversation about the art versus the artist kind of thing, because I think that is a little bit more nuanced. But when you're talking about theory specifically, I think exercise the theory from the theorist completely. And if the theory holds water, the theory is valuable.
Yeah.
And I need to remind myself that more about figures like Stalin.
Right.
I am really interested to read some Stalin, even though, I think I'm still working through undoing a lot of the kind of brainwashing around Stalin specifically that I've been subjected to.
Yeah, I think Stalin is definitely the figure in my mind that holds the most water for, because I don't know, it's hard not to view his actions as some kind of like internal propaganda,
Yeah.
Like, I'm certain there's merit to his theoretical writing, but when you hold that in juxtaposition to some of his other writings, like anti-Trotsky writings, then they might not seem as critically important or theoretically important. So yeah, that's kind of an odd one. And I guess it's right now, I think we are too shallow to really make that judgment call,
Agreed, yeah.
Obviously, I mean, but at the same time, it's like, I'm not going to sit down and read and compare fucking 18 different books about Marx just to try to get an adequate image, because ultimately it's not important to me. I think that what he's saying in this text, it doesn't matter who he is.
I would agree with that. With this text specifically, I think regardless of who wrote it, the conclusions are quite evident and quite valid.
Yeah. And just to say, I mean, we'll get into this book soon enough, I'm sure. But just to say, like, I have a degree in economics. It's a bachelor's. I'm not fucking saying I'm some whiz kid economist, but a lot of this stuff was like really, an echo of the basics I learned in college, right? Like, it's not anything crazy. It's just that because it's written by Marx, we have this, these are like evident ideas,
Yes, I agree. Which I also think is, well, we'll get into that when we talk about our reception of the work. I think that has a lot to do with the way my reading of it was colored. Speaking of education, though, one final thing, I do think it's important for us to acknowledge and accept Dr. Karl Marx. He did have his doctorate in philosophy, right. And I'm not necessarily arguing that like a degree makes you more qualified or anything like that. But put some fucking respect on this man's name, Dr. Karl Marx.
Yeah, Dr. Karl Marx. I've literally not once heard someone say,
exactly,
Dr. Karl Marx. I'm just thinking about, like, is there a doctor on the plane? It's like, my PhD is in, comparative analysis.
So our work for the week is Wage, Labor, and Capital, written by Karl Marx, written in 1847, first published in 1849. Wage, Labor, and Capital is a foundational text of scientific socialism that serves as something of a precursor to Marx's perhaps better-known work, the aforementioned Capital. Das Kapital. Centered around defining the inverse relations between capital and wages, Marx uses the work to define key elements of his burgeoning economic political philosophy, namely the definition of a commodity, definition of wages, and the distinction between labor and labor power, to name a few. It is through this revealing exploration that Marx develops and describes his labor theory of value, or law of value, depending on your fancy, a cornerstone of his later writing. Thus, Wage, Labor, and Capital is an essential read for any burgeoning Marxists seeking to put language to the ever so obvious inequity of economic and social relations rampant in today's modern workplace.
I love the way you said revealing exploration, because that's really the way that I think that Marx has laid this out. It's a little bit like this in The Little of Capital I've Read, which is one-ish chapter in some audiobook that I definitely didn't listen to. But I really like the way that this is written, because he's like asking the question, a very simple question. The book literally starts with like, what is wage? What is a wage? And it keeps almost spiraling out. I don't want to say spiraling because it's a little
develops.
Yeah, it's a little bit tighter than a spiral, but it starts with that question, what is wage? And then he answers that question, and that answer brings up another question, and he keeps keeps layering in these questions until finally it's like, oh, by the way, the whole system is geared for collapse and must be overthrown in a worldwide war. It's like, there's something to that, It follows a very developmental process, like you said.
Yeah, and I also used, not to get too pedantic about the writing of that introduction or whatever, but I also used that word because, as most good Marxists will tell you, he didn't create this theory, he discovered this theory. It was revealed to be the truth, historical materialism. Yeah. It's not something that he made up, it's something that he found.
Right. Yeah, Capital did this already, and he just put it to words.
Exactly. It was revealed.
Yeah. He talks a lot about classical economist theory here. Mm-hmm. But I think what makes Marx so interesting is that he is in agreement with those people, but at the same time, he's saying, like, there's gaps in these definitions. There's something underlying here that's being missed just by the traditional definition. Mm-hmm. When he talks about what makes capital, it's not just that it's like the accumulated labor power, right? It's that there's an extra layer of a social relation there. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thing that I think really makes Marx so incredible, is that he's operating within the realm of classical economics that, you or I might already know. And he's going one layer deeper than that, which is really nice.
Yeah, I think he's, like you said, he's identifying the things that are otherwise overlooked or kind of brushed aside and saying, like, but no.
Yeah. I used to think of economics, and when I was justifying to myself why I was getting a degree in economics, aside from the fact that it was a business degree but a little more specialized, is I really liked the idea that you could model the world if you held certain assumptions true. It's like, if you hold the assumptions in the model, then the model works this way. Thus, if the assumptions are held in the real world, you can model the real world, And the assumptions are, I think, where the root of that problem is. And I think that, I don't want to say Marx is operating without assumptions here, but he does a lot more to lay a groundwork, I would say, rather than some of my previous teachers, which have been a little more hand-wavy. So
yeah, he doesn't seem to come to a conclusion that's not justified.
Yeah, that too. It's hard to read this piece and to disagree, I think. I mean, I don't know. I would be, a better way to say that is I would be interested in reading some critiques of this. I would be interested, maybe not necessarily from like a capitalist perspective, but from like a well-meaning economist to really examine wage, labor, and capital and say, how well does this framework apply to the actual world?
Well, that's an interesting thing to bring up, because in the edition we're reading from, which, what is it technically?
International Publishers. Yeah.
Yeah, so the International Publishers edition, which pairs this with Value, Price, and Profit, which I'm sure we'll get to,
yes,
has an introduction written by Engels, written in, 1891?
Yeah.
In 1891, and the introduction is interesting because, well, one, he just kind of summarizes the entire work in the introduction, which I thought was funny. But two, because he mentions that because this is early in Marx's development of the law of value, for example, that there are things that he refined later that Engels mentions, like...
Yeah, using labor power instead of labor.
Yeah.
I like the way that he says it, where he says, like, this isn't as Marx wrote it in 1848, but it is as Marx would have written it in 1891.
Yes.
I trust Engels to do that, clearly.
Yeah. Well, and so to the point of critique, a non-bourgeois critique is like, it was a work early in the development of Marxism that even they found ways to critique and refine in the 40 years after its publication.
Yeah. When was Capital written? Because this was written before Capital.
Yeah,
so that makes sense.
It is a precursor to Capital.
Yeah. There's something interesting there. It's hard to discuss it without having read Capital, but it's like, where are the values of reading this versus where are the values of reading Capital? One big value, obviously, is that this is a 48-page book, and Capital is like a 3-tome volume.
Yeah.
Or 3-volume set of tomes. So yeah, that's nice.
Is there anything from the preliminary that you wanted to talk about before we jump into the what are wages?
Yeah, well, there's one thing, is that he does say worldwide war. That I know we've been talking maybe as one happy day about a revolution, but clear that Marx thought there would be violence.
Yeah, that quote, every revolutionary uprising, however remote from the class struggle its objects might appear, must of necessity fail until the revolutionary working class shall have conquered. That every social reform must remain a utopia until the proletarian revolution and the feudalistic counter-revolution have been pitted against each other in a worldwide war. I just appreciate that he is jumping straight into it and saying, like, here's what's going to happen, and then he spends the rest of this 40 pages saying, like, here's why it's got to happen that way.
I was just thinking about at the top when he says, this is unrelated, but when he says, we've been reproached for neglecting to portray the economic conditions. I love that someone's like, you don't know what you're talking about. There's not even a basis here. I don't know. Marx does a lot to really clarify his economic position here. One interesting thing about the preliminary that I will say is that on the next page, page 16, he lists out 3 great divisions. The relation of wage labor to capital, the inevitable ruin of the middle classes, the commercial subjugation and exploitation of the bourgeois. Only the first part was written. So that's actually the footnote 8 at the bottom. He didn't make it. He didn't make it happen. So just another. Marx is, that's 2 things now that Marx said will be mini volumes and then did not finish.
Yeah.
Capital was supposed to be, I think, 6 volumes or 8 volumes. We definitely wouldn't be reading it then. You know?
Damn. Well, yeah. So what are wages? And what I thought was interesting is as I was reading this the first time, I wrote wage defined part 1. And then a few pages later, part 2. And then a page later, part 3.
Okay.
So if I were going to try to define wages, I think it starts on 17 at the end of that first paragraph. He says, wages are the amount of money which the capitalist pays for a certain period of work or for a certain amount of work. But then he starts to introduce labor power.
Yeah.
And so on page 19, he amends that definition a little bit. He says, wages, therefore, are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by himself. Wages are that part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. So there's already a nuance introduced here in the definition of what wages are with this inclusion of his new term, labor power.
Yeah.
And I think he closes the chapter with the kind of final definition of that on the bottom of 20. Wages, as we have seen, are the price of a certain commodity, labor power. Wages, therefore, are determined by the same laws that determine the price of every other commodity. So that's not necessarily a redefinition, but a clarification of why the definition is what it is.
Yeah, and it's that same thing. I mean, even in that third part there, I love that answer immediately follows up with another question, right? He says, well, it's priced like every other commodity. In that case, how are commodities priced?
Exactly.
One thing about the second part of that, when he says wages are not a share of the worker in commodities produced by himself, I think that's there to tackle maybe like an underlying assumption, right? Maybe a common sense assumption where someone might say like, my labor is like enshrined in this commodity I've produced, where Marx is saying that there's actually a timeline of events here, right? There's a timeliness to it that we will explore later when we talk about capital itself, but that the idea that the labor power is being thought as a future almost, it's not that they're purchasing, 30% of the cloth they're going to make or whatever. Like the problem is that the book is layered up and it's hard to talk about like the middle layer without also hitting the bottom layers. But what I'm trying to say is that it might be easy to assume like, oh, if I work X amount of hours, then X amount of money is being put into the product I'm making. When Marx is saying that that's not the case, it's that your labor power is being bought as like a time frame. I don't know. It's a little confusing almost, and I didn't really for this part at least, I didn't get a huge clarification from this book.
On the definition of labor power, or
just on the sense that when he's saying that the labor is not part of the commodity that's being produced, it's something that's like previously spent. I don't know. Let's move on from that. I got myself into a loop there.
Well, I do think that second part of the definition okay, full disclosure of my idiocy, I don't know much about the timeline of Marx's writing and where and when certain ideas prop up for the first time. But what I see in that second part of the definition of wages is alienation.
Yeah.
Starting to sneak in here, where there is a disconnect between the maker and the product or the commodity. And so there's an alienation inherent there. But additionally, I think that he's starting to introduce this idea of an alienation between a laborer and their labor.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. In fact, just looking down at what else I have highlighted on 19, he's not even thinking of his own labor as part of his life, just as something he has to give up. It's not that he's producing a product at all. He's just producing the wage to survive. It doesn't matter what your labor is actually going to ultimately, as long as it's paying your bills, is what he's saying here. And I think that is absolutely part of the alienation you're talking about.
Yeah. In fact, I have this quote on page 19 marked where he acknowledges that. He says, "This life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing his own existence. He works that he may keep alive. Yeah. He does not count the labor itself as a part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life." And I think that is, one, beautifully stated, two, a good distinction between the labor and the laborer, and how that labor power is being sold by a laborer in order to sustain their life. Right. Capitalists will provide the minimum wage necessary for subsistence, and like a laborer then has to sell their labor power to the point that they can survive. It's not I wrote a song about this, so if anybody's interested, it's called Commercial Conscription. It's this idea about how we sell ourselves. It's a blood tax that we pay.
Hell yeah.
And it's exactly this sentiment. And I think it is dope that he brought it up.
Yeah, I think the quote at the bottom really sums it up. I just love the way Marx writes sometimes. "And the laborer who for 12 hours long weaves, spins, bores, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stones, carries hods, and so on, is this 12 hours weaving, spinning, boring, turning, building, shoveling, stone breaking regarded by him as the manifestation of life? As life? Quite the contrary. Life for him begins where this activity ceases, at the table, at the tavern seat, in bed. The 12 hours' work has no meaning as weaving, spinning, boring, and so on, but only as earnings which enable him to sit at the table, to take his seat in the tavern, and to lie down in bed." It's so eloquent, and it's so real. I mean, I think that's something that goes unacknowledged by people, especially in the modern day, because they think of their career as their life, We've had this conversation plenty where it's like, am I working to live or living to work?
Yep.
And I think that many people think one way and are doing the other, It's easy to think of yourself as a careerist in a specific field. That obviously is a changing notion. I think that's kind of falling out in the modern day, as we've talked about before with the Zillennials and whatnot. But it's just crazy to hear it written, to hear it spoken aloud in fucking 1863.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those common sense things that he lays bare that would be really fucking hard to disagree with. And I think anyone in modernity, if they are honest with themselves, would and should acknowledge the truth in it.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a byproduct of this kind of commodification of laborers themselves. Like, the profession that we were both previously in, teaching, is a perfect example of how the work you do is made to become an important part of your identity.
Yeah.
To a point that is terribly toxic.
Yeah,
and ruins your ability to ever shut off, to ever step away from your labor and begin to live, as he says.
Yeah. Page 19, big banger. Big banger.
I actually have something else from page 19.
A big banger.
Not to necessarily turn this into an advocation for veganism, but I'm going to turn it into an advocation for veganism.
This is your podcast. Do as you please.
On the bottom of 19, when he is talking about this commodification, he says, "The slave did not sell his labor power to the slave owner any more than the ox sells his labor to the farmer." And I think it's important for us to acknowledge the subjugation of animals in this context. And as good Marxists, ask ourselves the question, of do we want to participate in that form of commodification? Philosophically, even moving beyond the very obviously evil animal agriculture industry. Yeah. So even if we move beyond the industrialization of animals as commodities, as living sentient beings, what I would call persons, as commodities, that is a byproduct of that level of industrialization in the animal agriculture industry. Even beyond that, philosophically, yes. Can we square that? Can we square the subjugation of animal as slave labor as Marxists? I submit that we cannot.
I think that on a purely philosophical level, I absolutely agree with you. I think that that's just one of those contradictions of life, baby. You know, I'm going to chalk it up to a contradiction. No, I'm not. It reminds me, honestly, of I'm reading Black Jacobins right now, and it's really interesting because the colony sends a delegation back to France during the Revolution, and they say, you know, do we not also deserve the rights of man, etc.? And the big French response is like, are you joking? Like, how dare can you ask for the rights of man when you literally have slaves? It's like, are these men or are they property? The reason why is because the colonists are like, we should get 16 seats in this delegation because of our massive population. And they're like, wait a minute, are you counting slaves in that? If so, they're men and should be given the rights of man. That's what we did this whole revolution for. It just kind of reminds me of that. It's the same thing. And I don't like that in this situation, as a meat eater, I am the colonist in this metaphor, but it's there's something interesting there. I mean, much in the same way that that's what he's saying. Like, the slave is owned in the same way the ox is owned, you know? And he does that to make the distinction between the old mode of production and the new one. That's something that I think that's like a really important thing that is a little obvious, but I'm glad he puts it into words, is that he obviously believes in historical stages of development, right? Like a feudal society, and then we're now in a capitalist society. And he says that, not in this chapter, but later on, that society is determined by what has domination over the production. You know, what makes this society a capitalist society is that labor has no option but to sell itself. That is the mode of production, the majority at least. You know, and on top of that, on page 20, I really appreciate that he goes even further than that. It's not even that, like, it's not even a binary, right? The free laborer, on the other hand, sells his very self, and that by fractions. He auctions off 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his life, one day like the next, to the highest bidder, to the owner of the raw materials, tools, and means of life, i.e. to the capitalist. He belongs neither to an owner nor to the soil, but 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of daily life belong to whomever buys them, right? There's something really disconcerting about that idea. It's like my subsistence it's completely attached to my ability to find a buyer in the market, you know? And if there's no buyer, then what do? You die.
You starve.
Yeah, exactly. What the fuck, man?
Yeah.
Saying that out loud is like brutal, because it's easy for us to say we're proletarian, but most Americans don't fucking view themselves as that.
Yeah.
You know? Temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
Exactly.
It's like, no, man, you don't have the option. Your choice is this: work or die, you know?
Yeah, people will say, well, life ain't fair. Get used to it. Like, that sort of thing where it's like, you know, sell yourself or starve. It's like, well, life ain't fair.
Yeah.
That's not a justification
just
for
the
that.
way the world works.
Yeah. And continuing our motif of me highlighting everything around what you had just quoted, I did have the free laborer part highlighted, and then I loved the way he closes that paragraph there, where he says, but the worker whose only source of income is the sale of his labor power cannot leave the whole class of buyers, i.e. the capitalist class, unless he gives up his own existence. He does not belong to this or to that capitalist, but to the capitalist class.
Yeah.
There's just no way out of it. Once you accept this as the reality that you live in, once you acknowledge this is the reality you're forced into, perhaps is the better way to put it, you are no longer a person living for yourself. You are now a person that must sell themselves in order to survive.
Yeah. I mean, especially thinking about like the idea of the mode of production dominating society, he talks about later, everything in society is socially built. You don't have the option to live on your own. There is no true off the grid. To do so means you have already taken your share of the exploitation, right? You've built up, you've accumulated enough to go live on your own or whatever. Nobody has the option to do that truly. You know, exploit now or exploit later. I mean, that's basically it. Or be exploited now or be exploited later.
This opens a realm of study that I don't know anything about that I would like to investigate, because it always comes back to TikTok nowadays, I guess. But on TikTok, when I've seen quite a lot of creators responding to folks saying, like, I just want to move into the middle of nowhere. And everyone always says that inevitably always devolves into eco-fascism.
Yes.
And I'm like, I don't know what those words mean. So I would like to study that a little further.
Well, I mean, ecofascism is a crazy one. I mean, it's the same thing as like, you'll hear people be like, I'm not having kids. How can you bring kids into this world? It's like, that's an eco-fascist ideal right there. You know, it's very fucked up.
Oh, I feel attacked there. That's definitely the way that I feel.
I'm not judging anyone for making that decision, because I also felt that way until I was like, okay, whatever.
Yeah. We talked about that on an early episode.
Yeah, we did. And the thing is, too, I don't know. I have a lot of complex feelings about it, and it's not worth getting into right now.
It's something worth investigating for sure. I would like to know more and understand it better.
There's no freedom. There's no freedom. It's not free. You've taken your toll already, if that's the case. You know, that's truly how I feel.
Freedom isn't free.
Freedom isn't free. There's a hefty fucking fee.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, so if wages are determined by the same laws that determine the price of every other commodity, how is the price of a commodity determined?
Yeah.
That's our next question here. It might seem crazy, but it's really not. You know, the price of commodity is determined by the cost of production. In fact, I love the way, just to skip ahead into the chapter, I love the way that Marx says that, because, you know, he says like, oh, what would make a high price? What would make a low price? These things are all relative. Just go ask anybody. Go ask any regular citizen, and they'll tell you directly. What gives you the idea of a high profit? It's the fact that you've made more than your cost of production. Any common man can tell you that. It's not a hard concept to grasp. You know, it's just another step in this building process. He does a lot of good, like, common man examples in this, and I think this is one of them. Like another Alexander the Great, he will cut this metaphysical knot with his multiplication table. He'll tell us, if the production of commodities which I sell has cost me 100 pounds, and out of the sale I make 110 pounds, that's an honest, sound profit. If in the exchange I receive 120 or 130, that's a higher profit. It's like, gee, really simple stuff when you think about it. There's no need for it to be a mystical idea. You know, that was a big issue when I was studying economics, is that nobody knew what the fuck they were actually talking about. They were happy to say the words, but I don't think anyone actually was understanding the root cause. I obviously felt that way because I didn't give much of a shit too. It's really nice reading this and giving a shit and like really trying to boil it down to the basics and put them into consideration. In fact, I was worried before coming to record this that I was going to be like, can I even talk about these ideas? You know, do I have a firm enough grasp of these basics to put them together into complex ideas? I don't know.
So good.
Yeah, yes. And that's something that you build it like any other skill, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I don't have a lot to say about this one. I think, obviously, then moving from defining wages to having questions about commodities, then the value of a commodity comes the cost of production. It's like a very linear kind of logic that he's using here.
Yeah.
And I would say my only feeling about it while I was reading this, my primary feeling while reading this was like, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Duh.
Right. That's the thing, though, is that it's like, duh. You know, it keeps building up, and then suddenly it's like,
thus.
Yeah. Oh. And then, like, because of these things, because of all these basics he's laid out, it's like he's setting up all the walls in the fucking maze, and then there's only one pathway to the end. And it's, I'm not saying that he's like coercing us into this, but it's like you can only come to one conclusion, and it's the conclusion that Marx writes here, you know, and we agree with that conclusion,
obviously,
you know, but yeah, it's interesting. It almost feels like a trap, except I don't think it is. Like there's too malicious of a connotation there, you know. I
mean, he's obviously trained as a philosopher. This is the way all philosophy is written. It's like, here are the questions, here are the suppositions, what are the conclusions that can be drawn? Yeah. And so, like, he leads you through this logic very clearly in the same way that Descartes leads you through the logic that leads him to question the self, the existence of the self. In the same way that, you know, Plato leads you to questioning the idea of forms. It's like a pretty common form of philosophical argument. And I think the fact that it feels so self-evident is evidence of its strength as an argument.
Hell yeah.
That's the end of my statement.
Fair.
I said that like I had more to say.
No, you're good. I love even in the beginning of this chapter when he's talking about what competition among the sellers is, what competition among the buyers is. That's obvious to us maybe, but you know, just to set some basics. But I really love the metaphor he says at the bottom of 21. Industry leads two great armies into fields against each other, and each of these again is engaged in battle among its own troops. The army among whose troops there is less fighting carries off the victory over the opposing host. And I think that there is something important in this chapter in what he says directly after that, right? That given the example here where he says 100 bales of cotton in the market, there's purchasers for 1,000 bales of cotton. So it's a simple idea. Demand is higher than supply.
Supply, demand, yeah.
Nothing crazy, But he says the buyers will compete. Okay. In the given case, then, one buyer seeks to drive the others from the field by offering a relatively higher price for the bales of cotton. Okay. And then, right, so that's the buyer side. Mm-hmm. They're in competition because they need it. They must buy this commodity because often it's the means of subsistence, right? That's the main thing. So there is competition on the buyer side regardless. Then on the other side, though, the cotton sellers who perceive the troops in the most violent contention among themselves and who therefore are fully assured. So they know they're going to make their sale one way or the other because look at the fucking buyers. They're clawing at each other's throats.
Yeah,
they will give us a high price.
Yeah, they're frothing.
They will beware of pulling another's hair. So, peace reigns in the army of sellers. They stand opposed to the buyers like one man, fold their arms in philosophic contentment, and their claims would find no limit did not the offers of even the most importunate of buyers have a very definite limit. So, I love that idea because it immediately undercuts what he just said. It's like, there is competition among the buyers, there's competition among the sellers. The victor is who has the least competition. And then he immediately is like, the sellers clearly are not competing in the same way. I just think that's a great example. And then he goes into, what's high or low.
Yeah.
Okay, and then he gets to the main point here. This is an important point that he sets up, is that the current price of a commodity is always above or below its cost of production.
Yeah.
There's a natural fluctuation in the price that it never reaches equilibrium. And that was particularly interesting to me because that's a big idea in basic economics, is that supply and demand intercept each other, right? They pull each other up and down until they hit equilibrium price. And that's maybe the first big step away that Marx has from main economics, is that he says that equilibrium price is never reached. So just an interesting point there.
That's, as someone that has no foundation in economics, I wouldn't have thought of equilibrium as something that ever really happens.
Yeah.
There will always be a push and pull in supply and demand based on, all of the variables and conditions that surround a particular commodity being produced.
It's like the 101 lesson is that they'll pull up, I've seen this graph a million times, not so much, it's been 8 years since I was in college, but it's the X graph. It's the supply is one line, demand is the other. That point in the middle is where they meet. That's their equilibrium price. And that's the idea of this invisible hand, if there's demand is greater than the supply, then the price will go up. Or if the supply is greater than demand, then the price will go down until it reaches that equilibrium price. What Marx is saying is that the fluctuation pulls it beyond that price one way or the other.
Yeah.
And I think it's part of that competition that he gets into later, where he's saying the increase of competition in a field leads to an increase in production and then back down to the equality of production. The price fluctuates and it never hits equilibrium price. That's a big idea that Marx is putting out here.
I feel like when I read that, I thought of, and I highlighted that line that you used, the actual price of a commodity indeed stands always above or below the cost of production, but the rise and fall reciprocally balance each other. I thought of that about the kind of tendency toward monopoly, the idea that the sellers recognize that they will always have the upper hand and therefore this is a dumb example probably, but I think about gas prices a lot as there's obviously conspiracy for the price of a gallon of gas or petrol.
Yeah. Yes.
And so that creates this, it's a thumb on the scale.
Yeah.
I don't know another way to say it. So maybe I was moving beyond what he was trying to say here. Maybe I was misinterpreting it completely, but I was seeing this kind of metaphor of the battle and how there's going to be competition among the buyers and there should be competition among the sellers, but the sellers are effectively saying, hold fast.
Yeah.
Is them putting their thumb on the scale,
Yeah.
Conspiratorially tending toward monopoly.
Yeah, well, I think that Marx still does believe in competition among sellers. I just think that he thinks of it manifesting itself in a different way. Oh. Later when he talks about the necessity for an increase in production, he talks about the competition in sellers. He says there might be a case where you can think of a capitalist exploiting another capitalist instead, right? I think that the need to further divide the division of labor, right? The need to further increase the technological productivity of your industry, that kind of thing is what leads to monopoly, He even says the small firm can't exist. And so, the middle classes become more proletarianized. Yeah. And that's because in search of that in search of that competitive advantage, they don't have any other choice but to, congregate, to monopolize, to extend credit is another thing he says. All of these things to circumvent these kind of limits that are imposed by maybe a natural market in the sense. So I do think that there is something about monopoly here. I think it's just more so in like the striving for that division of labor.
Yeah.
It's literally that point we were talking about earlier where it switches gears. It's no longer about laying the basics, but now drawing the conclusions.
Yeah.
I mean, dude, I dog-eared that page because I'm like,
yeah,
I was like, oh, fuck, this is the juice. Like, this is it. Yeah, I think there's something to be said about monopoly here, but in this specifically made me think of equilibrium price because it's that same thing earlier. If you hold the assumptions true, then you can model the ideal, right? It doesn't hold the assumption, right? In reality, what happens is that the price goes above. It goes below the cost of production. It fluctuates above.
Yeah.
That kind of like sine wave is what exists in reality because of the factors that Marx describes here. If the price is higher, capital floods into the market and it creates these, let me just read what it says. A mass of capital will be thrown into the prosperous branch of industry, and this immigration of capital into the provinces of the favored industry will continue until it yields no more than the customary profits, or rather, until the price of its products, owing to overproduction, sinks below the cost of production. So that flood of capitalists into the industry creates an overproduction. There's a lot in here that I think is directly linked to that crisis plethorique, the crisis of overproduction. Mm-hmm. That overproduction is fundamental in Marx's theory of crisis. I mean, obviously it is, but we can see the trappings of that here, where the profits rise. There's a greater division of labor. There's a greater necessity for invention. That requires an ever-growing mass of people to work in these industries, and that overproduction is what is leading to these crises, because the greater proletariat can't buy they don't earn the value to buy what they create. That's part of the equation. If they're making X amount of surplus value and only being paid, say, half of that, then they're never going to be able to buy that value because they make half of it. This book was juice, man. This was juice for me. Where was he? The next question he asks.
By what are wages determined? This is probably the shortest chapter, I think. It's a page and a half long.
Yeah.
And so he asked this question, what then is the cost of production of labor power?
Yeah, that's the link between the last chapter and this one. If we're talking about how price is determined, it's the cost of production, then you got to understand that the cost of production is the same as the price of the labor, because the labor is what does the production. So in that case, if the price of the labor is the wage, what determines the wage?
Yes.
See how it's building on it? Well, you obviously see this, but it's I just love that. I just love that little...
It's good.
Yeah.
He's proving that he's a doctor.
Yes. Dr. Karl Marx. I'm never going to not refer to him as that now.
Thank you. I think we need to start it. I think it's a trend that needs to catch fire.
Yeah, it's a CIA psyop. They've been trying to delegitimize Marx by dropping the doctor in his name. Okay, so what is the cost of production of labor power, Aaron?
Well, he says it is the cost required for the maintenance of the laborer as a laborer and for his education and training as a laborer. So this is what I think is... We already made mention of this earlier when we talked about the minimum wage of subsistence is effectively what that cost is going to be. The price of his work, speaking of the laborer, will therefore be determined by the price of the necessary means of subsistence. The wear and tear of the worker, therefore, is calculated in the same manner as the wear and tear of the machine.
Yeah.
And the cost of the existence and propagation of the worker is effectively what we're talking about. We're not talking about the thriving, the actualization, comfortable living. We're talking about the subsistence.
Yes. I need to skip ahead to the bit where he talks about minimum wage. Is that in this? That's not in this chapter.
Yeah, the wages thus determined are called the minimum of wages.
Yeah. It is in this chapter, thank God. Because I love his definition of minimum wage here. This minimum wage, like the determination of the price of commodities in general by the cost of production, does not hold good for the single individual, but only for the race. Right? Individual workers do not receive enough to be able to exist and to propagate themselves, but the wages of the whole working class adjust themselves to this minimum. That was so modern to me because think of the minimum wage. It's what, $7.56? You cannot live on that. Nobody can,
yeah,
right?
Not even close.
It's just that the scales are balanced against that minimum. You know, that's just like the enforced minimum. The state has said, like, we can hold class antagonisms at bay at this price. You know, it's just the fact that, like, nobody can live on the minimum wage. It rang so true when he's like, it's not an individual wage. He's just saying that, like, at the barest minimum, that's the most we have to pay to stave off revolt. And I thought that was so brilliant because, like, the minimum wage is shit. It doesn't exist to serve as an actual minimum wage, the minimum amount that you, an individual, can live on. It just exists as the barrier, the lower bound.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a commentary that Marx makes, but something that I think is an interesting byproduct of that is, over time, creating this kind of federal minimum wage that we have here in the States and having it be that type of wage, a wage that is not a livable wage, a wage that could not sustain anyone's life, has created in a lot of the lumpen proletariat, I would suggest, this notion that there are jobs that are not valuable enough to merit an actual living wage, and creates this class antagonism within the proletarians, within the proletariat, that has become a huge barrier for us moving forward with any sort of, like, unification of the proletarian class.
I think that's a fucking fantastic point, because it's like, what are you going to go flip burgers for $7? You know, it's like, yeah, you should be able to do that.
Yeah.
It's not trite or anything, but I love, you know, a starter job should be able to buy a starter home. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's like a wonderful idea, but it only works if the minimum wage is actually like the minimum that a single person needs to survive.
Yeah.
You know, I also love that it's like that coercive threat. You know, it's like you can't just get away with working at fucking McDonald's or whatever. I'm sorry to keep using McDonald's as an example. That seems punching down a little. But, you know, it's like if you can't get by working these shit ass jobs because they're shit, you know, and it's exactly what you said. It like completely almost dehumanizes those positions, because it's like you're making the bare minimum.
Yeah, I've gotten into conversations with my family at, like, Christmas about shit like this.
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, those jobs are supposed to be a starter job. Those are supposed to be for teenagers. You're not supposed to live off of that income. That's supposed to be like a supplemental income, or, you know, all of these different sorts of things.
Says who? Besides you, like, not you, but, you know, it's like, who's fucking telling you this?
Yeah, and the other layer that I think that I was trying to impart upon my family was, like, this is also the level of work that is often available to ex-cons, for example, people that are trying to come in, trying to re-enter society to become, quote, productive members of it, and the only work that is available to them is a fucking minimum wage job at McDonald's.
Yeah.
And all power to people that can do that shit. I flipped burgers at Wendy's for a number of years. It was fucking miserable. I hated every second of it. It's not work that I think most people could do. Mm-hmm. It is valuable work, and it is hard work in ways that I think a lot of people undermine and discredit. But, like, every single person deserves a living wage.
Yeah.
And this is a job that is available to people, a class of citizen that has been denied that right in every other capacity. And we're like, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, asshole. It's like, how?
Yeah.
This isn't a living wage. Like, I don't know. This is just bonkers.
I totally agree. In fact, I think that, I mean, this goes without saying, but they keep it low intentionally, so you're closer to starvation. You know, you're in a more coercive position, or coercible position, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I'm still feeling the strain of poverty. You know, I'm still feeling the threat of homelessness, of starvation, of all these things. You know, I might be working 10, 12, 15 hours a day, as Mark says, but, you know, I'm barely making enough to provide for myself, let alone maybe my family.
Yep.
You know, and that's fucked.
Also, if these jobs, McDonald's, is supposed to be jobs just for teenagers, do you ever intend to get a hamburger for lunch? Because who the fuck is working that job if this is a job that's supposed to be only for teenagers? Think it through.
Fucking put that minimum wage at $15 and let them replace it with fucking kiosks, man. I don't need people working at McDonald's. Okay, if it was fully automized, I'd be thrilled. Okay, not to say that, like, all those people in the job should be kicked out of their job, obviously, but it's like, man, if only we did something to, like, alleviate these terrible jobs, you know. But the problem is, as maybe Mark says in here, is that, like, displacing people from one job by a means of technology does not ensure they get better jobs at all. In fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way to bring that back.
Yeah. So a short chapter, but it's because it's fucking obvious. And I think that the minimum wage quote there was really revealing to me, because I've always had that consideration. It's like $7.56 isn't anything. How are you going to live on that? The point is not to live on it.
Yeah,
you know?
you can't.
Yeah,
is the short answer.
Yeah, 1841 or whatever. When was this written again?
1847.
You know, yeah. Come the fuck on. Finally, chapter 5, I think this is where it starts to get real juicy, because he starts to talk about what the fuck is capital. You know, we might throw around the word capital a lot, but what does capital actually mean? You know, as a classical economist might tell you, it's simply the accumulated labor that serves as a means to new production. So say the economists. But there's something more critical there. It's not simply the accumulated labor. Right? It's not simply something that serves for new production. It requires a social relation. And I love the example he gives, right? I don't want to say Negro. I'm really sorry. I guess I just will. What is a Negro slave? A man of the black race. The one explanation is worthy of the other. And then he says, a Negro is a Negro. Only under certain conditions does he become a slave. You know, it's not that to be black means to be a slave. There is a connection there that makes one thing the other. Much in the same way, a cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton. Only under specific conditions does it become capital. All right. And I think that that's really good, because, you know, when I was learning economics, capital was explained just as that, you know, the tools to make more tools, right? The tools to create things. It's like there is something more than that. There is something more than that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the thing that hit me the hardest on this was where he leans into explaining the social relations of production and how they transform, and how capital has to be a consideration in that conversation about the social relation. He says on page 29, where he is first laying out that capital also is a social relation of production, he continues on in that paragraph to say, the means of subsistence, the instruments of labor, the raw materials of which capital consists, have they not been produced and accumulated under given social conditions within definite social relations? Are they not employed for new production under given social conditions within definite social relations? And again, I think that is a relatively self-evident, obvious conclusion that is often unstated. And I think it's a pivotal part, a cornerstone of his kind of philosophy, and definitely a cornerstone of this work moving forward.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Just to go down in the middle of the page, she says, capital consequently is not just a sum of material products. It is a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes.
Yep.
You know, just as I was saying earlier, everything in society is produced socially. Everything that we use, every commodity is produced socially. And it's just the idea that this relationship is what creates the idea of capital. The main thing on the next page is when he says, how does this sum of exchange values become capital? Well, as the power of a part of society, it preserves itself and multiplies by exchange with direct living labor power, right? And then this is the one. It is only the dominion of the past accumulated materialized labor over immediate living labor that stamps the accumulated labor with the character of capital. And it's that same thing I was trying to get at earlier when he's talking about timeliness. The capital is something that was accumulated in the past. It's not something that's expended in the moment. Well, it's something that's accumulated previously and then takes domination over the present era. Something that's not mentioned in this book, but I know Marx talks about, is the idea of primitive accumulation. Where capitalists come from ultimately is people that have accumulated in the past, and that accumulated production becomes the capital that is then laying the basis for our modern society. I'd be interested in reading some of his more historical works, maybe on like the revolutions of 1848, to get kind of deeper into that idea. But, you know, if the idea is that capital has to be previously accumulated, where did it come from, right? What was the previous state? And I know that it's like feudalism or whatever, but I need a little more specificity than that.
Yeah, I would agree. I love you skipped the line right in between this, again, the one that I highlighted. The existence of a class which possesses nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital.
Yeah. Well, you know, as he says in the next chapter, it's that the two condition each other, right? Yeah. He's very clear that, you know, there cannot be capital without wage labor, and there cannot be wage labor without capital. So it's very funny, the idea that, well, I'll hold that. But, you know, they condition each other. That's the big idea, right? It's, Yeah, I will actually say it. It's very funny that the capitalist is so quick to dismiss the wage laborer when they literally rely on it. It's interesting. Maybe it's an undergirding part of the crisis is that their need is to dismiss the labor, and that labor dismissal is part of their own destruction. Because it's a requirement.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean that's why unionization, collectivization of the workplace is an important thing, because it's like, yeah, the capitalist needs the laborer just as much as the laborer needs the capitalist in this case.
The world could exist without bosses, but it could not exist without workers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we should just jump into the next chapter, because that is a good segue into it, because it's all about that relation of wage labor to capital. I also think this is a pretty good development at the start of this chapter of that kind of sacrifice of life that he mentions earlier.
Yeah.
Because as is his motif, he starts this with a question. What is it that takes place in the exchange between the capitalist and the wage labor? And his answer is the laborer receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power, but the capitalist receives in exchange for his means of subsistence, labor, the productive activity of the laborer, the creative force by which the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but also gives to the accumulated laborer a greater value than it previously possessed. It's that same sort of kind of thumb on the scale sacrifice of life that is necessary for the wage laborer.
I love on page 32, the next page, the 1 shilling has therefore been consumed in a double manner, right? The capitalist consumes it reproductively. He has created not only his means of existence, right, the amount that he pays the labor, but he's created more than that.
Yeah.
Whereas when it's consumed by the wage laborer, it is unproductive, because the only thing you get out of it is the means to exist longer.
Yeah.
And within that time is the requirement that you replicate the same process. It's the requirement that you then go back to the market and say, more subsistence, please.
Yeah,
more.
Because it's been expended.
Yeah, it's gone.
Yeah.
You have no choice.
Yeah.
You have no choice. The capitalist gets double duty, man. They have the ability to pay for you, and then they get some more.
Yeah.
They get some more.
I had landlords in my mind the whole time I was reading this. Just the fucking uselessness. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I know. That makes me think of it's like internet stories where it's like I was 2 days late on my rent, and my landlord was like, my mortgage is late now.
Yeah.
It's like, who am I paying your mortgage?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, I need your rent so I can pay my mortgage.
Yeah.
Fuck you.
Fuck, dude. Capital can multiply itself only by exchanging itself for labor power, by calling wage labor to life. The labor power of the wage laborer can exchange itself for capital only by increasing capital, by strengthening that very power whose slave it is. That's something that I really like here, is that he's saying, the economist might say, wage, labor, and capital have the same goal, right? What's the point of this antagonism? We're on the same team. If we succeed, you succeed. If the rich are wealthy, then it'll trickle down, right? In fact, he even says the crumbs will fall down, He gets into it a lot in this chapter. I love, though, on the next page, on 33, where he says, to say that the interests of capital and the interests of the worker are identical signals only that they are two sides of one and the same relation. The one conditions the other in the same way that the usurer and the borrower condition each other. Yep. So it is not that they have the same goal. It is just that their existence is intertwined.
Yes, I like the way you said that. Yes, exactly.
Word.
No notes.
Yes. Yeah. Just a lot. This chapter is when it really started to pick up for me, because even a little further down, right? The example in the middle of page 33, house may be large or small as long as the neighboring houses are likewise small. But if a giant palace were to be next to this house, then it would shrink to the size of a hut. So it doesn't matter that you're improving both standings, because the person at the bottom of the chain is still looking up the mountain at this fucking golden peak.
Yeah, there's still an inequity baked into it that continues to grow further, more and more inequitable.
Yeah, it's not even that they're both increasing at the same rate. There's an idea in economics that's called the marginal propensity to save, the marginal propensity to consume. It's a very basic idea. And
oh, well, that makes me feel dumb for not knowing it.
It's basic for, I've studied economics. I took classes on it. It's like an early level thing. It's not something that you, the layman, would understand. Not Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? But it's this idea that if it's like a percentage, basically, if you were to gain $1 extra, right? That's what marginal means. What is the chance that you would save it? What is the chance that you would consume it? And the classical economics says that the poor have a much higher propensity to consume, because that's what they're limited to. They have no option but to spend that money on direct consumption because it's necessary for their survival.
Yeah.
However, the wealthier you get, the less that propensity becomes because you don't have to. So what Marx says here on 33 rings especially true because he says, rapid growth of productive capital calls forth a rapid growth of wealth, of luxury, of social needs and social pleasures. Therefore, although the pleasures of the laborer have increased, the social gratification which they afford has fallen in comparison to the increased pleasures of the capitalist. It's a crazy parallel to what he says later, where he's saying even if your real wages have increased, the relative wages fall, and that fall in the relative is what really matters in the scope of this cycle.
You know, it's funny, that quote that you just read, I had that marked here because I had written millennial economics next to it. Because I think, again, if you pay attention to the discourse around wealth inequality, a lot of people are saying like, well, the millennials are the most educated class in the history of the United States. Talking about the Western world, talking about the U.S. I can't speak, globally in this case. Millennials are the most educated class age group, the educated class to ever come out. The millennials per capita are making more money than their parents did at this age. But the difference, of course, is that the money doesn't go as far. Just because we make more money, wages have stagnated relative to the cost of living. And so there's this idea that pleasures of the laborer have increased, the social gratification which they afford have fallen in comparison with the increased pleasures of the capitalist, which are inaccessible to the worker in comparison with the stage of development of society in general.
Yeah.
So like just because we make more money, like literally, than our parents did, doesn't mean that we are living a life as quality as our parents did on less money.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's the difference between nominal and real, It's like we might make more money overall, but it doesn't go nearly as far. You're exactly right. Even on top of that, millennials, you know what they spend their fucking money on? Going to restaurants, right? Buying immediate gratification entertainment. And it's like, yeah, of course. I don't think that's not a slight against millennials. It's just like it's simply exemplary of the circumstance that we live in. I have an app that tracks my spending, which I don't use for anything. It's just there. It tracks. It's supposed to be budgeting, and it also tells me what subscriptions I have active. But the nice thing is that it scans my transactions and it keeps track of how much I'm spending. It keeps track of my monthly bills. It keeps track of my budgeting. It'll tell me if I go over budget. It'll say like, you're spending too much at restaurants, whatever. Mm-hmm. But the fucking thing, man, is that, especially since I've stopped making $50,000 a year, is that it's like, you spent 176% more than last week. Here's an idea of what affected your bill the most. And then it's like groceries, rent. I'm like, that's always the funniest. It's like you spent 600% more, and it's because I paid rent the last week.
Yeah, it's bullshit, man. Like the purchasing power that is available to us, like the percentage of one's income that was necessary to buy a house, for example, is just so wildly out of whack.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just fucking crazy. And I think it's just so self-evident to me.
It's self-evident to everybody. You can Google the fucking graph, real wages versus productivity. Okay? And you can see it. The productivity has gone up, 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 up. Real wages have plateaued. Okay? And they've been that way for 30 years.
Yep.
Right? Probably since the fall of the Soviet Union. Curious. No, anyway. But so now that we have talked about the relation of wage labor to capital, right? You might wonder, what determines the rise and fall of profits?
Yeah, he doesn't open this one with a question so much as a supposition. He says that we have said wages are not a share of the worker in the commodities produced by him. Wages are the part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a certain amount of productive labor power. But he goes on to say, the capitalist must replace these wages out of the price for which he sells the product made by the worker. And so then he uses that as a transition to talk about selling price.
Yes.
Which is in three parts. He says, first, it's the replacement of the price of the raw materials. Second, the replacement of the wages advanced. And third, the surplus left over, i.e. the profit of the capitalist. And so I think this is him laying the groundwork for surplus value and all of that. I will say the quote at the start of the next paragraph, I think, is dope.
Real wages remain the same?
Right before that. Oh. While the first part merely replaces previously existing values, it is evident that the replacement of the wages and the surplus, the profit of capital, are as a whole taken out of the new value, which is produced by the labor of the worker and added to the raw materials. So again, a very fundamental Marxism 101 kind of idea here is that the raw materials may have some value, but the real value of the commodity doesn't come from the raw materials. It comes from what is produced of those raw materials by the worker.
Yeah, that's the power of labor, is to take nature and create value from it. Yeah, the reason he does this is, it becomes clear in a minute, is that it's because if wages and profit are split from that surplus value, then they're connected in the way that that if one goes up, the other must go down, because there's only so much of that surplus value to be split.
Yeah.
Right?
It's that inverse proportion.
Yeah. The first part, the part that's replacing the material, like, or the maintenance, right, or the fuel or whatever, that part is already taken care of, right? That's inherent in the production. The value is already there because it comes from the raw materials. So every other bit of the value is coming from the production of the labor. And he's saying that because if we're trying to describe why wages and profits rise or fall, it's important to understand that they're connected inversely like that.
Yeah.
Right? It might be possible to think that you could raise both, but in fact, Marx is saying that, in order to raise profits, wages must decrease, right? And it gets into that same thing about real wages versus relative wages. It's actually what I had underlined the next part. Real wages may remain the same. They may even rise. Nevertheless, the relative wages may fall. Let us suppose, for instance, that all means of subsistence have fallen 2/3 in price. The day's wage has fallen but 1/3. Although the worker can now get a greater amount of commodities with these 2 shillings than he formerly did with 3, his wages have decreased in proportion to the gains of the capitalist, because now the capitalist has 1 more shilling in profit.
Yeah, and so he says, profit indeed has not risen because wages have fallen, but wages have fallen because profit has risen.
Yeah.
One begets the other. I will say at the end of this chapter was the one point that I had some pushback in what he was laying out here. I wasn't even sure I was with him on his, it's not a conclusion, but on what he's laying forward as part of this law. It's on 38.
Okay.
And I fully acknowledge that this might come from a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of what he was saying. But he says near the top of the page, the acts of overreaching and taking advantage of one another within the capitalist ranks necessarily equalize themselves. So he's saying with the same amount of another man's labor, the capitalist has bought a larger amount of exchange values without having paid more. Okay, so, okay, there's that. In the second place, it must be borne in mind that despite the fluctuation in the price of commodities, the average price of every commodity, the proportion in which it exchanges for the other commodities, is determined by its cost of production. He's saying, like, those 2 things are true, right? Mm-hmm. And so then he says on 38, at the top of 38, the acts of overreaching and taking advantage of one another within the capitalist ranks necessarily equalize themselves. The improvements of machinery, the new applications of the forces of nature in the service of production, make it possible to produce in a given period of time, with the same amount of labor and capital, a larger amount of products, but in no wise a larger amount of exchange values. The part that I had pushback on was that line that I isolated at the start, that overreaching and taking advantage of one another will necessarily equalize itself within the capitalist class.
Yeah.
Does it? I've not seen evidence of that. Well, I've seen it as like, oh, they're pushing that far, so I'm going to push that far, and maybe then I'll push even a little bit further, and then they'll push a little further. And it doesn't become an equalizing force. It becomes a unilateral force.
Well, I think that the context for me lies within what he says later about the competition between the capitalists, where he's saying that whatever advancements one capitalist might make are immediately then adopted by other capitalists.
Yeah.
That might be the most reasonable explanation in my mind. I do agree with you that it's a little confusing, even a little further down than what you said. This is his example. If by the use of the spinning machine, I can furnish twice as much yarn in an hour as before its invention, for instance, 100 pounds instead of 50, in the long run, I receive back in exchange for 100 pounds no more commodities than I did before for 50, because the cost of production has fallen by 1/2. I don't really understand exactly why he says that. Is it because the cost has, by producing double, he's reduced the cost by half? I am a little confused there.
Yeah, I was getting a little lost.
Yeah, I think I am in agreement with you on that point, but I think it makes more sense later on when he's talking about the adoption of technology, right? The further division of labor as then immediately being adopted. I think when he's saying that they equalize themselves, that's kind of the point I came to.
Okay.
So not necessarily a satisfying definition, but I agree with you that part is a little confusing.
Yeah.
If you're a Marxian economist, you can reach us at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Please let us know if you, by use of the spinning machine, furnish twice as much yarn in an hour as before. say 100 pounds instead of 50, why would you receive no more commodities?
Yes.
Yes.
leftsunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Yeah. Okay, now this next chapter I think was the biggest banger for me because I think this is really where he's getting to the core of his philosophy, right? The fact that the interests of capital and wage labor are diametrically opposed.
Yep.
Just to start us off, right? To say that the worker has an interest in the rapid growth of capital means only this, that the more speedily the worker augments the wealth of the capitalist, the larger will be the crumbs which fall to him, and the greater will be the number of workers that can be called into existence. The more can the mass of slaves dependent on capital be increased. Right? As we said before, profit and wages are in inverse proportion. So, just to go on to the next page, he says, the material position of the worker has improved, but at the cost of his social position. The social chasm, as we said earlier, that separates him from the capitalist has widened, right? The gap between the proletariat and the working class has increased.
The hut and the castle.
Yeah, the hut and the castle, exactly. Right? And then this is really my favorite here. The quicker the working class multiplies and augments the power inimical to it, the wealth of another which lords over that class, the more favorable will be the conditions under which it will be permitted to toil anew in the multiplication of bourgeois wealth, at the enlargement of power of capital, content thus to forge itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its train.
Yeah, I just wrote banger quote next to that.
Huge banger, because that's exactly it. I mean, the drive to do that work, right? The compulsion, I might say, only furthers the entrenchment of the classes, right? The toil of the proletariat further increases the proletariat. I'm looking again at 40. He says, we dare not believe them, even when they claim that the fatter capital is, the more will its slaves be pampered. I love this quote. The bourgeoisie is too much enlightened. It keeps its accounts much too carefully to share the prejudices of the feudal lord, who makes an ostentatious display of the magnificence of his retinue. The conditions of existence of the bourgeoisie compel it to attend carefully to its bookkeeping. It feels almost like the bumbling empire idea, you know? There is rationality behind these decisions. To think that, like, you can slip through the cracks, maybe, I think is maybe a little naive.
They're too closely attendant to their books, kind of thing.
The system that we are operating in is one of cold calculation. It's not of random chance. We talk a lot about the market as this kind of anarchistic thing. You know, there's no organization. But the reality is that the organization of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is not something that is by chance, right? It is something that is created, right? It is something that is propagated. It is something that is compelled by the bourgeois in their action, and they're well aware of what is required to continue their existence. And acknowledgement of the requirement even might be what leads to their downfall ultimately, because it is that striving for that infinite growth. You know, it's this produce. He says it in here. Maybe not on this page, but he says, like, it whispers in your ear, march, like you must continue, you know, because to give up is to give up your own existence, you know, much in the same way that the laborer has to labor because the only option otherwise is to give up their existence, much in the same way the capitalist must be capitalizing because the alternative is to disappear, right? Or in this case, since you're in the context of the greater world, to be proletarianized.
Yeah.
You know, just to skip ahead again, I love when he's saying that even the middle-class capitalists will, by need of something to do, by want of some way to fill their time, add their arms to the outstretched masses, which the forest of which grows ever thicker as the arms grow ever leaner. He was snapping off in these fucking last couple of chapters.
Yeah, I will say there is a big shift in his rhetoric and in the kind of prose in the last couple of chapters. Yeah. I think when he shifts from talking specifically about economic policy to talking about political ideology, there's a shift in his rhetoric too. Yeah. And I'm here for it.
Yeah, it's great, man. Okay, just to continue, I highlighted at the bottom, I hate to keep reading quotes just without analysis, but, you know, the one capitalist can drive the other from the field and carry off capital only by selling more cheaply. So it's that competition we talked about. In order to sell more cheaply, he must produce more cheaply. So in order to produce more cheaply, he has to increase the productive force of labor. Right? To increase the productive force of labor, you need a greater division of labor, or you need an improvement in machinery. So therefore, in order to achieve this early goal, keep that goal in mind, that the only goal here is to outcompete the other sellers. Okay. To do that, he has to produce cheaply, and to produce cheaply, he has to increase the production. To increase the production, he has to increase the division of labor or the machinery. And then, he says on 41, the larger the army of workers among whom the labor is subdivided, the more gigantic the scale upon which machinery is introduced, the more in proportion does the cost of production decrease, the more fruitful is the labor, and so arises among the capitalists a universal rivalry for the increase of the division of labor of the machine. Just like I was saying earlier, you don't have the choice. If somebody else further subdivides their labor, you are undercut. You have no choice but to compete in that same market, or else give up your capitalist nature.
Yeah. To your point about the subdivision of one's labor, I was thinking a lot while reading this about, I don't want to sound like an anti-worker kind of person here, but like skilled labor, quote, skilled labor, how the skills of one's labor have over time become more and more subdivided to the point that a worker no longer needs to carry the same amount of skill in order to, what do you say, like perform the given task, right? He gets into this in the next chapter, I think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely he does.
So maybe we should save the conversation for that. But I was thinking a lot about like Henry Ford and the production line, and how we've, in my chosen vocation of woodworking, about how the skilled, building a piece of furniture requires many, many skills, which can be performed by an artisan, that can be handicraft of an individual, or it can be subdivided into 100 different tasks that require one minimally trainable skill that then will produce a piece of furniture at the end. But each one of those 100 people doing that minimally trainable performance, performing that minimally trainable action, are significantly more exploitable, significantly more vulnerable to exploitation, and have less and less to offer in the quote marketplace if and when they are expended by the capitalist. And I don't have a conclusion. I was just thinking a lot about that and how I think that has come to bear, I guess.
I think it comes back to that same thing where it's like everything that we use in this world is socially produced. You know, it almost reminds me of like any sufficiently advanced technology is indecipherable from magic. It's it's like any advanced technology is seen as magical. You know, we could live on like just bread from grown grain or whatever, but every even the knowledge, like the training to make those things. I was thinking about what you were talking about with woodworking. It's like if all you know is to pull the lever to drive in the screw or whatever, then you might not know how to make a tendon joint or something. My woodworking terminology is weak, but it's that same thing, you know, like I couldn't go produce plastics, right? Even though the needs of my life require the consumption of plastics. That's a poor example, obviously, but that's the thing. It's like that skill is lost in the subdivision, much in the same way, and much to the benefit of the capitalist. Even I think that subdivision is like a further exploited point.
Yeah, and back to your McDonald's automation example from earlier before. There is a point where technology and machinery should be advanced to make certain tasks easier, make certain tasks obsolete to the worker, like something that we don't have to consider, for the betterment of society. The problem is what that does, that kind of advancement of technology, is another thing that becomes exploited by the capitalist without the benefits of that exploitation being equally shared among all people. And so, like, all it really does when you go to the self-checkout line at Kroger instead is cost someone a job.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's not having any measurable effect on the quality of life of any individual other than the capitalist.
Yeah, that's obviously my big concern with advancements in technology and automation and whatnot. And just from the little analysis I've seen on what Marx says about the advancements of technology, I know that there's a section of Capital where he talks about the introduction of the machine, right, the machinery, and that can be construed out to a modern example, but he says much the same, you know, where he's saying like the benefits of this technology are not going to the worker, and that's obviously a bad thing.
Yeah.
Even if like on a philosophical level, you know, maybe we could automate the shittiest jobs, that would be great. But even maybe on the flip side of that, it's like the material, the production necessary for the creation of that automation is another layer of exploitation.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I will skip ahead here because I think he says exactly that thing on page 46, right? he's talking about like the primary contradiction here between capitalists expanding and then the proletariat. But he says an exception to this law has been adduced, namely the workers who are employed in the manufacture of the machinery itself, right? So you might say, if you're the guy that builds the machines, you have a little more secure of a position because you're not being replaced by machines. But then he says, since the year 1840, this is 1840, by the way. This assertion, which even before that date was only half true, has lost all semblance of truth. 1840, by the way. Let me just repeat that. For the most diverse machines are now applied to the manufacture of the machines themselves on quite as extensive a scale as in the manufacture of cotton yarn. And the laborers employed in machine factories can but play the role of very stupid machines alongside of the highly ingenious machines. So it's exactly that thing.
Yeah, number one, I was drawn to an allusion to Kurt Vonnegut again, his first novel, Player Piano.
Okay.
Takes this as its basic premise that manufacturing has become so automated that the only jobs left are the people tending to the machines that are doing the automation.
Yeah.
Main character is one of those engineers. Secondly, to that point though, but the machines are then going to be used to make the machines, and so there's another level of exploitation that becomes evident here. He continues right after that. He says, in place of the man who has been dismissed by the machine, the factory may employ, perhaps, 3 children and 1 woman, and must not the wages of the man have previously sufficed for the 3 children and 1 woman? So not only are you taking what was 1 exploited worker and turning it into 4 exploited workers, 1 woman and 3 children, but those 4 workers now have to share the wage that was previously given to 1 man.
Yeah.
So there's yet another layer of exploitation at play.
Oh, God.
All over this chapter, I was seeing connections to imperialism. I think the benefit of us read Imperialism by Lenin.
Yes.
And the concept of imperialism in general as in natural extension of capitalist exploitation. I think the benefit of us reading things out of order in the way that we are is that I'm seeing all sorts of connections like this. And this is another perfect example where there is a very clear connection of the kind of tendency toward imperialism that comes from the exploitative nature of capitalism.
I think that that's a great way to get back into what we were going to talk about in the previous chapter, because it's that exact expansion, right? On pages 41 and 42, Marx goes into a great example where he says, say by a greater division of labor, by the application of new machines, by advanced exploitation, whatever, a capitalist has found the means of producing with the same amount of labor a larger amount of products. If, for instance, he can produce a yard of linen, Marx loves fucking linen and coats, man.
Yeah.
If he can produce a whole yard of linen in the same labor time at which his competitors weave half a yard. So that's an example. Say you're Eli Whitney or whatever, and you invent the cotton gin. Now suddenly you can do cotton more effectively. Mm-hmm. You didn't need me to say that, but whatever. How will this capitalist act? He could keep on selling half a yarn at the old market price, but this would not have the effect of driving his opponents from the field and enlarging his own market, which is part of the competition of sellers that Marx describes, right? His need of a market has increased in the same measure which his productive power has extended. Right? The more powerful and costly means of production that he has called into existence enable him, it is true, to sell his wares more cheaply, but then compel him at the same time to sell more wares. Yep. So there's an expansion in the need of what is required to sell. And it's exactly that thing in imperialism where it's like, I've hit everything in my market. You know, what do? Just stop? No, I simply expand the market, right? Yep. I find new markets. It's a natural conclusion to think that the simplest definition of imperialism I've heard is the expansion of capitalism beyond one's borders.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's so fucking true. And it's not just for funsies. It's because the increase, like the actual competition between sellers is compelling them to produce more in order to gain that advantage. Not only is it enough to sell at a lower price, to undercut your associates, but that new lower price means you must sell more to make the same amount.
Yep.
God damn. Right? And then on the next page, the privilege of our capitalists is not of long duration. Other competing capitalists introduce the same machines, the same division of labor, and introduce them upon the same and even greater scale. You fool! Look at what you've opened Pandora's box. Now everybody is doing this, you know? And now they therefore find themselves in their mutual relations in the same situation in which they were before. Well, we're back at fucking square one. You know, all of this work, all of this extra exploitation, this extra division of labor, this extra machinery, all of the negatives that come with that. And what have we gained? Nothing. Nothing.
Yep.
We're back at the same thing. That's why we have all of these regulations. That's why we have copyright. That's why we have these things, is so you can contain that competitive advantage for as long as possible. Because the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, understand that the second that that competitive advantage is lost and you're back at square one, the cycle begins anew. You know, every time the cycle repeats, we get closer and closer to fracture. It's like making a copy of a copy. You know,
it gets degraded and degraded.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You know, the market is expanded and expanded and expanded, and in our minds, it's like, okay, great, whatever, I sell more product. But in the realistic fucking boundary of the world, it's like this cannot continue.
Yeah, it cannot go in infinitely in a finite expanse.
Yeah, man. Yeah. So that takes us to chapter 9. I know we dug into it a little earlier, but now we know about this capitalist competition. What is the effect of the competition on the working class, the capitalist class, the middle class, etc.?
Yeah, it says that they're constantly enlarged, revolutionized, and division of labor necessarily draws after it greater division of labor, the employment of machinery, greater employment of machinery, work upon a large scale, work upon a still greater scale. That expansion indefinitely.
This is the quote I was talking about earlier. This is the law that throws capitalist production out of its old ruts and compels capital to strain evermore the productive forces of labor for the reason that it has already strained them. Because you've pushed it to the limit has now been pushed.
Yeah.
Damn.
To use that example, it's not, the directive isn't to stop pushing, it's to push the limit further.
Yeah, it's to keep pushing. There's no stopping point. But yeah, this is what I was getting at.
March.
It constantly shouts in its ear, March, March. This is no other law than that which within the periodic fluctuations of commerce necessarily adjusts the price of commodity to its cost of production. So that same cycle we were talking about earlier, that sine wave above and below the cost, is because of this continuous march of production, right? It's this continuous growth. My God, I'm getting fucking fired up.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, okay? This is the crux of all of this. The capitalist will have gained nothing more of its efforts, except they have gained a more difficult condition for the profitable employment. So, because of this condition, because of this recurrence, right, it is now harder to make a profit. If we're talking about a pool of capitalists, less capitalists can reach this profitable point. That explains a trend of profit falling, right? Because in this new condition, in this new scenario where you have to produce double for half the cost, it is harder to reach profitability for anybody, okay? So that gets back into that kind of monopoly thing, right? You have to monopolize, you have to create these, different ways to subvert that limit.
Yeah. And there's more of that kind of expansion, that imperialist expansion, like he says. If we now conceive this feverish agitation as it operates in the market of the whole world, we shall be in a position to comprehend how the growth, accumulation, and concentration of capital bring in their train an ever more detailed subdivision of labor, an ever greater improvement of old machines, and a constant application of new machines with feverish haste upon an even ever more gigantic scale.
Yeah. It makes me think of, this next bit makes me think of what we were talking about earlier, where the career has become the point of your life.
Yeah.
He says that in the last analysis, the worker competes against himself as a member of the working class. Think about like the superstar teacher, right? They're going so far above and beyond, but that's not a condition that everyone can meet, and by the creation of that standard, that's now the standard that you have to live up to, even though we know it's untenable. Right, just to draw a parallel to what we were talking about earlier, it's that same thing.
Yeah, 100%. I was just lost thinking about teaching. I mean, being a subpar teacher is an untenable situation. Yeah. Being an exceptional teacher is damn near impossible, and certainly not something that can be done in a reasonable amount of time in anyone's life. But yeah, so this is where he's talking about that division of labor, though, that really struck me, that I was thinking a lot about manufacturing specifically, like, because there are things we need to survive, to live a quality life or whatever, that there will be things that need to be made on a large scale to satisfy the needs of a given community, a given population. But like, that doesn't necessitate the exploitation of the producers of those goods, of those commodities, of that product. But when we talk about the division of labor, the greater division of labor, I don't know, man, it's just like, there's a romanticism in my mind of a maker making a thing.
Yeah.
I have this idea, I have these materials, my community needs this thing, to talk about the Shakers. That's exactly where furniture making came from the Shakers. Every house needs to be furnished for everyone in the community. So someone needs to make all of the furniture for every member of our community. And I think that there's something beautiful and romantic about a person saying, like, my neighbor needs a table. I've got this stack of cherry.
Yep.
I'm going to make them a table. And there are a lot of skills required in that. And it hopefully becomes a skill that you can pass on to an apprentice or another individual working in your workshop that can then continue on that kind of continuum that can go along that continuum of providing for the needs of one's community. I think there's something beautiful in that. It's what has always spoken to me about the handicraft of woodworking in particular, and it's why I like doing it.
Yeah.
But like when we're talking about the division of labor, it exercises all of the romanticism out of that action, and it turns something that's kind of inherently beautiful into something inherently ugly and fucked up. And I just don't like it. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's a great point in there, even on the previous page on 44, when he says that the laborer competes not only by selling themselves one cheaper than the other, right? They're competing with other, but they also have to do the work of 5, 10, 20 men. It's even in like a communal idea, it's like there's not even a body of people working together. It's now like one guy pulling a lever. I think of like Goofy fucking stamping the license plates in the Extremely Goofy movie. I don't know why.
What a specific
reference.
I know.
It's just, I've seen that movie a billion times, and he works in a toy factory and his job is to do one thing. And it's like this symbol of like his monotonous midlife crisis of failure. And that's why he's like, oh, I'm going back to college. Gosh. A horrible Goofy impersonation. Yeah. Sorry to derail it there.
Yeah, but this is what I mean with that division of labor. Marx even says the special skill of the laborer becomes worthless. And it's because the value is only in the commodity. The work, the value of the production is completely alienated.
Yeah.
It's completely removed. And in this capitalist hellscape that we live in, the special skill is in and of itself and not worthwhile. And therefore, once the skill of that laborer becomes worthless, ultimately, maybe to come back to the idea of like our labor being a part of our identity, when your skill becomes worthless, you feel worthless.
Yeah, he says neither physical nor mental elasticity. And I think that that's a great way to put it. Just even in the example you were talking about, if you can make a table, say, from wood, you can take those skills and do a lot of things with them. If you can pull a lever and make a table within a machine, you can't transfer that to anything else, I think the elasticity there is really what speaks to me, because the person becomes rigid. They become one-dimensional, perhaps,
Nudge, nudge.
Yeah. Curious. No. One thing I wrote on the side here, just the process that he outlines. A more division of labor means more access to the labor. That means more competition among the laborers, and that means a lower wages. So in 2 pages, Marx has described 2 incredibly fundamental principles. One is that there's a trend of falling profit, and 2, that there's a trend of falling wages. Both of those are explained here, and both of those are inherent in the crisis that he talks about.
To that vulnerability of the worker, as those things continue to happen and that division of labor continues to be further and further subdivided, he says, moreover, this is at the top of 45, moreover, it must be remembered that the more simple, the more easily learned the work is, so much the less is its cost of production, the expense of its acquisition, and so much the lower must the wages sink. So it pushes wages further and puts the worker in a more precarious position, which again makes them more exploitable for wages to go lower and lower and lower. It is the same measure in which labor becomes more unsatisfactory, more repulsive, do competition increase and wages decrease.
Absolutely. Jesus.
He just hits it so on the head.
Yeah.
I think I feel at a loss for comment because it's so plainly said.
Yeah, it's written out there. I can only agree fervishly.
Yeah.
This is that quote I was mentioning earlier where he says at the bottom of 45, we've sketched out in broad outlines the industrial war. The war has the peculiarity that the battles in it are won less by recruiting than by discharging the armies of workers, Because the increased competition among the workers lowers their wages. It lowers their wages. I'm talking about for employment. If more people are vying for employment, then the wage being offered would decrease as a whole.
Yeah.
So just another aspect of that.
This, like other things that we've mentioned, is a pretty clear byproduct of the basic supply and demand stuff that he lays out on like page 2 of this thing. That the more, 1,000 cotton bales versus the need of 100 or whatever. Like, if the supply exceeds the demand, the cost will go down. If the demand exceeds the supply, the cost will go up. And once workers are in competition with one another, we are inherently creating a surplus of supply that will thus lower wages.
Yeah, absolutely. It's within the basics. It's within the basics.
Yeah, it's just so fundamental, elementary in its simplicity and in its foundation.
Yeah, God damn.
Straight up. I have another quote that I think links to imperialism and capitalism's tendency toward imperialism, because he says, in the same measure in which the mass of products grows and therefore the needs for extensive markets, just like you said, in the same measure does the world market shrink ever more, and ever fewer markets remain to be exploited, since every previous crisis has subjected to the commerce of the world a hitherto unconquered or but superficially exploited market.
Yeah.
The need for markets increases while the supply of markets decreases with every new market seized.
Yeah. Well, just to go back a page, at the bottom, right? In the same measure in which capitalists are compelled by movement described above to exploit existing gigantic means of production, in the same measure do they increase the industrial earthquakes in the midst of which the commercial world can preserve itself. So not only they're seeking these markets it reminds me of shock therapy is what it is. It's like we're creating these big disasters to wipe clean the slate in this hope that we can then expand back into that market. We're destroying the markets to then go back into them. It's this kind of an attempt at self-replication. It's this attempt at this continuous growth. It's like we'll just fucking wipe it clean and then start over. It's the same thing.
Yeah,
it's the same thing. There's a little bit at the top of 47 I wanted to talk about here.
Okay.
No, actually, never mind. We hit this. But here's that quote though. Right. In addition, the working class is also recruited from higher strata of society. A mass of small businessmen and people living upon the interests of their capitals is precipitated into the ranks of the working class, and they will have nothing else to do than to stretch out their arms alongside the arms of the workers. Thus, the forest of outstretched arms begging for work grows ever thicker, while the arms themselves grow ever leaner. It is evident that the small manufacturer cannot survive in the struggle. Same thing we were talking about earlier, right? The monopolization is a requirement. It's not an option. It is a necessity for survival. It is evident that the small manufacturer cannot at the same time be a big manufacturer.
Yep. Damn, such a good quote. The outstretched arms growing ever thicker, the forest growing ever thicker while the arms themselves grow leaner.
Yeah. I also love the idea that it's like they're doing it for funsies. They don't even realize. They're like, I guess I'll work, I guess I'll hit the factories. Damn. God damn. All right.
Okay. In that case, I would like to close our reading with the penultimate paragraph of the text on page 48. If there is ever one conclusion that should leave you feeling affected, it is this one. But capital not only lives upon labor. Like a master at once distinguished and barbarous, it drags with it into its grave the corpses of its slaves, whole hecatombs of workers who perish in the crises. God damn.
Jesus, man.
That's a call to action without being a call to action. It's so fucking good. So fucking good.
Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
Say that. Damn, so that's Wage, Labor, and Capital by Dr. Karl Marx.
Dr. Karl Marx.
Mark.
There's one of my favorite tweets is from none other than Tim Allen, where he just says, Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, Wikipedia.
Yeah. And isn't C-A-R-L too?
C-A-R-L. Yeah. So, reader, that's my message to you. Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, Wikipedia. Yeah. Okay. So, what questions did this leave you with, Aaron?
Thank you, Will.
No problem. The pleasure is mine.
Questions. I mean, Honestly, I wouldn't say I was left with a lot of questions. The one thing that I brought up as a point of confusion or contention was that bit about the equalization of within the capitalist ranks. I'm not sure I understand that, where it's supposedly coming from, because from my view, I don't see an equalization. I see it more like you said. They push against the line, and the line is the thing that moves. It's not that the line pushes back. And so I feel like I'm missing something. It makes me wonder what else I need to read of Marx to make sense of that.
Yeah.
I know the answer is capital. I don't want the answer to be capital.
Yes. Well,
so that's
just to say, I will say that in the introduction, Engels actually says, thus much for our present purpose. Further information can be found for further reading. You can find it in Marx's Critique of Political Economy. So that might not be a bad option if we would like some further explanation.
Yeah.
And also in the first volume of Capital. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. If we were to try to tackle Capital, it would have to be chapter by chapter or a couple chapters by a couple chapters. And I wouldn't want to do it all in one run anyway. I'd probably want to space it out.
I suppose that opens another, this isn't a question so much as a comment.
Yeah.
I think the thing that has held me back from exploring a lot of Marx's work up until this point is I've always seen Marx as being much more inclined toward commentary on the economic factors that presuppose the political or social implications of communism.
Yes.
I don't really give a shit about that. I think my point is that, like, I agree with the fundamental thesis that this is a system of exploitation that must be overturned.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't need all of the
nuts
justifications
and bolts,
of why that is the case. Reading this has sort of shifted my position on that a little bit, in that I found this interesting, and I do think I still gleaned something out of it that's worthwhile. But, like, do I really need to read Marx if I agree with the fundamental thesis?
Right. Yeah. I can see that it's a grotesque machine. I don't need to know its inner machinations.
Exactly. The theory that interests me is the theory of action, the theory of what to do, what is to be done, one might say. And so that's why I've tended toward that sort of stuff.
Maybe that's, dude, it's like, Marxism, Leninism. It's like the beginning and the end. Not that, but like the groundwork and then the action, I mean, and that's how I view Marxism. In Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, even is like, that's, it is like Marx explains the why. I said this forever ago. I don't think I made it into the episode, but I was like, damn, I can't remember how I phrased it, but it was like each person had their own reason for being included in the name,
Yeah.
It's like, I can't remember what it is now. It was succinct. It was great. Trust me, bro. No,
Source, trust me, bro.
But yeah, I do agree with you to some sense. And I think part of the reason that I have such an interest in it is because it aids my confidence, right? Mm-hmm. Like reading this and recognizing that, one, it was stuff I pretty much already had a good grip on. It just needed to be expounded on a little bit. That's nice,
That's true.
One thing I've talked about before is that doing this podcast has given me more confidence as a Marxist. And
same.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes it feels like I'm talking out of my ass, and like reading these things prevents that, and I don't want to get into the internal debate of like, well, what's a proletarian or like the online Marxist debates. I don't care. Okay. But I am in search of that fundamental basis, and we've built a pretty wonderful set of a pretty great foundation with not this, but with this too, but with everything we've read so far, pretty much. And I view Marx as just another brick in that wall, maybe a big brick, but definitely one there.
Cornerstone,
yeah.
maybe.
Another thing is, the outlines of Marxist theory are painted by all of the other theories that we read. At what point have we seen enough of the outline to estimate the shape,
That being said, going into this, I sat down and read most of this in one sitting, and then I finished it in another.
Yeah.
This was a month ago when we were supposed to do it before. My bad.
My bad. I had company.
And then I read it again this week.
Yeah.
Just to get it again. After my first sitting, where I read like 25 pages of this or something like that, I was like, okay, my hot take is going to be the best way to read Marx is to read Lenin. Because I wasn't all that interested in a lot of the stuff that he was setting up at the beginning, all the question and answers, I just didn't really, I was like, I already know all this from reading State and Revolution. Right. Why do I need to read this again?
Yeah.
And that was going to be my hot take.
I totally understand that. The thing that negates that for me is that there are 3 volumes of Capital, you know? I know that Marx is talking about shit in there that I cannot ascertain without reading it.
Yeah.
You know? And to kind of push back on your idea that his work is like primarily economic, I have heard that really the main body of his economic work is in Capital Volume 1. Volume 2 and 3 are much more about the political situation. And I mean, we've clearly seen how Marx wields the weapon of history with fucking righteous fortitude. That was a crazy sentence. But he, I mean, seriously, it's like you can tell that he has a broad and deep, expansive historical knowledge
For sure.
that is applied to his political theory. I mean, he's rooting this in not vibes, but history.
I wouldn't think less of anyone with a PhD.
Yeah. Dr. Karl Marx. You know, that's kind of how I feel. And the thing is that there is not another way for me to get that except to read it.
That's true.
You know, I saw a bunch of books that were like Capital for Dummies. Not for Dummies, but that would be really funny if the For Dummies series had a fucking Karl Marx. I've also heard that it's, you know, it seems staggering at first, but once you get into it, it's not anything crazy. You know, he does have a very dense way of speaking, but as we've seen here, he builds it up one step at a time.
Yeah.
And I think as long as you don't miss a step, it's not hard to follow. I don't think that this is an easy read, but it's not a hard read. You know, it's one that I think takes effort to digest, but it is digestible.
Yeah, that said, the second time I read it was a much different experience, I think in large part because I was following his logic a lot more clearly. And by the time I had gotten finished with it the first time, I got deeper into the stuff that speaks to me a little bit more with it, which is the pathos prose, you know? I think those last 2 chapters,
Killer.
He really dropped some bomb quotes and like got me reacting to it on a much more visceral, emotional level. So the second time I read it, I had all of that. I was carrying all of that with me, and I enjoyed it a lot more the second time.
Yeah, even in what little I've read of Capital Volume 1, which again is like 6 chapters, he is fierce. I mean, he, you know, we talked a little bit about commodity, money, commodity, money, commodity, money, like those different cycles. And he starts to talk about, you know, what kind of person it is that hoards wealth. And he is violently angry. I mean, it's intense, you know, and that's what I remember from an audiobook. I was not seriously studying it.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad to know that the fire doesn't die.
no,
you know?
not at all. Not at all. Marx is a crazy dude. I do want to read one, not one of those, but not one of the ones I quoted, but I would like to read a biography of Marx. This goes for every book, every new topic I try to jump into, but it's really hard to, without prior knowledge, discern the ideological context in which a writer is writing.
Yeah, and I do think that that's important. I think that there is merit in that. I think, like I said at the start, I think theory is more separated from that than other forms of like creative expression.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I would like to know more about Marx and his life and understand more. I think it will help me contextualize the theory in a way that will be useful to me.
Yeah, and I did say earlier that it doesn't really matter what the person is, but I also believe that these were good people. You know, like Lenin as an example, I do think that he wielded terror as a means of repression. That's something that we've discussed plenty. You know, it's just the fact that I do believe his intention was to create a worker society. I don't think otherwise, you know. I'm not scared that reading a biography of Lenin will change that view, but there is a bit of pause I have about looking into like the vulnerabilities of Lenin or Marx or Stalin, you know. Stalin, I think, is especially a great one because he's so entrenched in the context of history. Not that Lenin wasn't or Marx wasn't, but it's supremely evident because of the actions that he took and the way that those actions are presented to us in the West versus maybe if we were, you know, like following Stalin's trail, we could pick up the pieces a little differently. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there is a line. There is a line where there is a point where I would no longer want to support the work of a person based on their actions as a human being.
I agree.
There is definitely a line. That said, I don't really want to know the vulnerabilities of Lenin or something like that because what matters to me is the principle behind the theory that he wrote.
Sure.
I agree with the principle. And even if he was too flawed a human being to enact that principle, it does not change my adherence to the principle.
Yeah. I think that this is just a tough conversation that communists have to have, you know, because it's exactly that thing. Like we're dealing with fallible people.
Yeah.
That's really the end of it, you know?
Yeah. So did you have any questions? Were you left with any questions?
Well, yeah. Not really. Much in the same way, I would love a little bit more enlightenment on some of those things. And the big question is, where do I get that kind of feedback? You know, the thing I really wanted here was a fucking professor. Like, I wanted someone to talk to about this that was like well-versed, you know, no offense. No.
Offense taken.
No, but like, I wanted someone that I could bounce questions off of and get answers that I know are factual. I'm not trying to put you down here, John.
No, I agree with that completely.
You know exactly what I mean.
Yeah. We're two lay people reading it on our own, trying to figure it out, as opposed to like being able to turn to someone that we know has an understanding or a foundational education around it.
Yeah. If you, the listener, have been listening to this for 13 episodes and haven't figured out yet that we're not Marxist scholars, okay, that we're really just trying to figure this out by reading it, you know, that we're discussing our gut feelings upon one or two reads of these texts, then I don't know what to tell you, right? Like,
I think you came to us for the wrong reason. If that's what you were looking for.
Yeah.
Hopefully you've stayed because you, like us, hope to, enact a liberation through self-education.
Yeah, exactly. At least to build the foundation, which I can then take to a more revolutionary project, you know?
Yep.
That's really how I feel. We've talked about this plenty, but I don't think that this is a revolutionary action that we're taking. I do, however, believe that it provides foundation for revolutionary action.
You know, I've been giving that a little bit of thought even just this morning, because I still agree that this is not a revolutionary action, but I do think that the first revolution has to come in one's mind.
Yeah.
And I think the act of education, whether that come through a reading group with your comrades, whether that be self-education, or what have you, I think that revolution must precede the revolution.
You got to kill the cop in your mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The revolution will not be televised. That's what was meant, is that it has to happen in one's mind first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I agree with that. And to that extent, it is a revolutionary action, goddammit.
Fair enough. You know, revolution is not a tea party, but it is a podcast. I wholeheartedly agree. Okay. What are we reading next?
We're going to read One Dimensional Man.
Yes, Herbert Marcuse. Yeah, I know a little bit about him. I'm excited to read. We've talked a lot about the alienation of the mind and the body in the factory, and I'm hopeful that this sheds some light there. Also, he is a contemporary scholar. He is a more modern scholar of Marxist theory, and I think that that'll be interesting. Critical theory has gotten some flack for being a little too theoretical, not enough practical. Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I think it'll be a fun one, and it'll be an interesting kind of cog in the larger machine that we have. That's a weird metaphor. We have put together an interesting collection of work here, I think, for these first episodes. It's fun to see us moving in the directions that we're moving. Yeah. It's atypical in a lot of ways, but I think it's served us well, as I mentioned earlier. I think this will be an interesting read to help us continue on in our journey.
Yeah, much as the answers give more questions to ask. It's much the same. You know, we're seeing these different threads and we're simply following them, and we're trying to find radical sources. You know, that's the main thing, and which has not been hard to accomplish. I mean, everything we've read so far has been pretty good.
Oh yeah, was this worth reading?
How you tell me, because I know you said you had something to say.
Well, that was my hot take.
You just read Lenin instead?
Yeah, my first go around, partway through, I was like, this is going to be my first no.
Yeah,
because I feel like I got everything from this out of State and Revolution, but finishing it the first time and then honestly rereading it affirmed for me that it was worth reading, in fact. And that I don't know that I would say it gave me ammunition so much as it helped reinforce, you said, made me feel more confident in conclusions that I've already drawn. I feel more confidence in those conclusions now. So I think it was worthwhile.
Yeah, I would agree. I really like this. That might be obvious. It was good to read Marx. I'll say that much, you know.
Yeah, I agree with that.
A little bit more of the man and a little bit less of the myth. That's what I think.
Oh,
sick, man.
If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, comments, recommendations for further reading, please leave those at
leftandredfeedback@gmail.com.
Correct. We would love to get some feedback on the show.
Yeah.
Any thoughts are welcome.
Hit us up.
Bye.
Take it easy.